There is a fairly large group of people talking about you right now, and the word that keeps coming up is sharp. Very sharp, actually. But what is interesting is that I do not think everybody in this group understood that about you at first. A few people did. A few of them watched you closely enough to realise you were taking in much more than you were saying. But others needed to see something happen. They needed to watch somebody push a story too far, watch you stay quiet, and then hear you ask one question that changed the entire atmosphere. And I am going to get to that question because I feel it embarrassed somebody more than you may realise. But first I want to look at this group, because not everyone here has the same connection to you. The first card is the Four of Wands. Symbolically, this is bringing me into a shared environment, a workplace, family circle, friend group, community, event, project, group chat, or some other space where several people are connected to the same situation. Some of these people know you directly. Others may mostly know you through what they have heard, what they have observed from a distance, or what one particular person told them about you. And that matters, because I feel somebody gave this group an incomplete version of you. Maybe they described you as too nice, too emotional, inexperienced, passive, or simply unlikely to challenge anyone. They may not have literally called you unintelligent. For some of you, they did, but for many of you, it was more subtle. They spoke as though you would not notice certain details. They assumed they could explain something quickly and you would accept it. They may have believed that because you did not interrupt, you did not understand. That was the mistake. I am getting two reasons this group has changed its opinion of you. The first has to do with how you handle yourself when somebody tries to provoke, pressure, or rush you emotionally. The second is different. It has to do with the way you notice patterns, remember small inconsistencies, and wait until you have enough information before you speak. And that second reason is where somebody ended up looking very foolish. Because there was a moment when they thought your silence meant they had successfully convinced you. It did not. You were listening to see whether the next part of their story matched the first, and it did not. And I think the inconsistency was small enough that this person did not realise they had created a problem for themselves. That is important. Because I do not feel you caught them saying something completely outrageous. It was more like one detail no longer fit. Earlier, they may have told you they did not know something yet. Then later they spoke as though they had already known it. Or they claimed they had no involvement, but somewhere else in the explanation they mentioned something they could only have known if they were involved. For some of you, it was a timeline. For others, it was who contacted whom, when a conversation happened, why a decision was made, or what somebody supposedly said. But you noticed it, and the card coming through here is the Lovers reversed. Symbolically, I am reading this as two things that are supposed to line up, but they do not. Two versions, two explanations, two pieces of information that should be able to sit next to each other without creating a problem. Except they could not, and I feel you knew that almost immediately. But you did not stop this person. That is what made this worse for them, because instead of saying, "Wait, that is not what you said before," you let them continue. You wanted to know whether they were going to correct themselves naturally, or whether they were going to build even more of the explanation, on top of something that already did not make sense. And they kept building. I am getting that somebody else in this group noticed a change at this point. Maybe not the contradiction itself, not yet, but they noticed something about you. You became quieter. Your face may have changed slightly. You stopped giving the person little responses that let them know you were following along. There is a difference between somebody going quiet because they feel intimidated and somebody going quiet because they are checking the information. And at least one person in this group understood which one you were doing. Meanwhile, the person speaking seems to have interpreted your silence completely differently. They thought they were doing well. They thought the explanation was working. So they added another detail. And that detail connected directly back to the first thing they had said. That was the moment. Because now you did not just have a feeling that something was off. You had their own words sitting next to each other, and one of those statements could not comfortably exist if the other one was true. I feel you waited for them to finish. You did not raise your voice. You did not give a speech. You did not accuse them of lying. You just asked something. And what makes this so uncomfortable for them is that the question itself was almost embarrassingly simple. The kind of question that should have had an immediate answer. But the second you asked it, they realized there was no answer they could give without creating an even bigger problem. And I think the question was something very close to, then how did you know that before it happened? For some of you, the wording was different. It could have been, if you were not involved, how did you know that? Or, if nobody told you until later, why did you mention it before? But the structure is the same. You took the first thing they told you and placed it directly beside the second. That was all. And suddenly this person had to explain both statements at the same time. I am getting that there was a pause here. Not necessarily a long, dramatic silence. It may have only lasted a few seconds. But it was long enough for somebody else in this group to look over at them. Long enough for another person to replay the conversation in their own mind and realize exactly what you had just noticed. And somebody here almost found it funny. Not because your question was cruel, because it was so obvious once you pointed it out. The card I have here is the Hanged One reversed, and symbolically, this feels like somebody getting themselves into a position they cannot easily get out of. They had been controlling the explanation while everybody was simply listening. Then one question stopped that, and instead of answering it directly, I feel this person started adjusting the story. Well, that is not exactly what I meant. Or suddenly there was another detail they had forgotten to mention. Maybe the timeline changed slightly. Maybe they began explaining what a certain word was supposed to mean. For some of you, they even tried to make the entire subject smaller. It is not even that serious. That response is interesting to me. Because you did not ask whether it was serious. You asked how two things could both be true. And somebody in this group noticed that too. The more this person explained, the clearer it became that they were answering everything except the actual question. You did not have to embarrass them. You did not have to say, "See? You are lying." Their difficulty answering did that for them. And I feel that is why this landed differently with the group. They were not being asked to take your side emotionally. They were watching something happen in front of them. They heard the original explanation. They heard your question. Then they heard this person struggle to make the two versions fit. And here is where this becomes bigger than that one uncomfortable moment, because once somebody catches one inconsistency, they start remembering other things. I feel several people in this group went back mentally after this. Things this person had said about you before. Descriptions of your behaviour. Reasons they gave for something you supposedly did. Conversations where only their version had been available. And now, for the first time, some of these people were wondering whether those stories had the same problem. And I think that is when some older conversations started sounding different to them. Maybe they remembered being told that you were difficult to work with, but now they were wondering what question you had asked before somebody decided you were difficult. Maybe they heard that you were overly sensitive, but after watching you stay completely composed in this situation, that description no longer matched what they were seeing. For some of you, somebody had questioned your competence. They made it sound like you needed things explained repeatedly, that you were confused, inexperienced, or not really aware of what was happening around you. But now you were the person who remembered the detail everybody else had missed. That creates a problem. And the card I have here is the Prince of Wands. Symbolically, this feels like confidence, presence, and somebody being much quicker than people expected them to be. But I also think there is something here about the difference between appearing confident and actually being able to hold up when somebody questions you. Because the person who was speaking may have looked very confident before you asked that question. They had more to say. They may have been louder. They may have sounded certain. But certainty is not the same thing as accuracy. And I feel some people in this group understand that now. Not everybody. I want to be clear about that. There is somebody here who does not particularly enjoy realizing they may have judged you incorrectly, because then they would have to admit that they accepted somebody else's description of you without checking it for themselves. So they may still be resisting this. Another person feels slightly embarrassed because they repeated something they heard about you. But then there is someone else who is genuinely impressed, because what they saw was not somebody trying to win an argument. They saw restraint. You could have interrupted much earlier, you could have challenged every little thing, you did not. And now they understand that your restraint was not because you had nothing to say. It was self-control. That changes how people read you. Before, somebody could mistake your quietness for being easy to dismiss. Now there are people in this group thinking, no, this person notices everything. Maybe not literally everything, but enough that you probably should not give them two different versions of the same story and expect them not to catch it. And there is one person here whose reaction feels different from everybody else's. They are not impressed. They are not defensive. They seem unsettled. And strangely, I do not feel this person necessarily dislikes you. I think they know something. Because while everybody else is only beginning to realize that they were given an inaccurate version of you, this person appears to understand why that version was created in the first place. And I think the reason is actually simpler than it first appears. This person benefited from you being underestimated. Maybe they needed to be seen as the one who understood the situation better. Maybe they wanted people to come to them for the explanation before anybody came to you. For some of you, they wanted sympathy. They needed the group to believe that they had been dealing with somebody unreasonable, emotional, confused, or difficult, because if people saw you accurately, certain parts of their position became harder to maintain. The card I have here is the Seven of Wands, and symbolically, this looks like somebody protecting a position, defending their ground, trying to hold on to an advantage once they realise other people are starting to question it. That is what I feel happened here. Your question did not only challenge one detail in one conversation, it challenged the role this person had created for themselves. Because if they were supposed to be the knowledgeable one, why were you the one noticing what did not add up? If you were supposedly the emotional one, why were they becoming defensive while you stayed calm? If you were the person who did not understand, why could they not answer your very simple question? That is where this gets uncomfortable. I also feel this person may be trying to act like none of this bothered them. They could joke about it. They could say you were being overly technical. For some of you, they may privately tell somebody, they were just trying to make me look stupid. But that explanation has a problem too, because you did not make them say two different things. And I think several people in this group understand that. There is even somebody who previously defended this person who is starting to notice a pattern. This is interesting because they are remembering that whenever the conversation stays general, this person is fine. They can talk for a long time, they can explain motives, they can tell everyone what supposedly happened and why. But when somebody asks for one specific detail, they get irritated. A date, a sequence, who said what first, exactly what they meant. Suddenly, the question itself becomes the problem, and this person who used to defend them is beginning to wonder why that keeps happening. I do not think everybody said this out loud in the moment. Some of it came later, because the conversation about you did not end when that awkward exchange ended. Actually, I feel the most revealing part happened afterward, after you were no longer standing there. After the person who had been controlling the story thought they could finally explain what had just happened without you in the room. And I do not want to pretend I know the exact words people used after you left. But I do feel the conversation changed, because somebody in that group essentially said, the question was fair, maybe not in those exact words. But that was the point they were making. They were looking at what had just happened and realizing that you had not attacked anybody. You had not twisted what was said. You had simply asked this person to explain something that did not match. And then somebody else started wondering why they could not do it. That is where the Justice card comes in. Symbolically, This is about putting two things beside each other and seeing whether they balance. What was said, what actually happened, what somebody claimed about you, what people just witnessed for themselves. And I feel that comparison was happening in this group after you were gone. There is somebody saying, in effect, they are sharper than I thought. And again, I keep getting that word. Sharp, not aggressive, not difficult, sharp. Because people are realizing that you did not need 20 questions. You did not need to dominate the conversation. You listened long enough to find the one place where the explanation could not support itself. That impressed somebody. But there is still another person trying to defend the one who got embarrassed. They may be saying that anybody can misspeak, that you took something too literally, that there was probably a misunderstanding, and maybe that is possible. But then somebody else brings up the part that is difficult to dismiss, your reaction. Because if you had started shouting, this person could have changed the subject to your behaviour. They could have said you were angry. They could have said you were emotional. They could have made the conversation about your tone instead of their answer. But you did not give them that, you asked calmly. And then you waited. That left very little room to redirect what everybody had just seen. But there is one person in this group who seems unusually unsurprised by all of this. I think they already knew you were observant. They may have known for quite some time, and strangely, I feel they deliberately did not explain that to everybody else. They watched. They let other people form their opinions. Maybe because they wanted to see who would actually pay attention to you instead of simply accepting what they had been told. This person could be connected to the group through work, family, friendship, or some shared responsibility, but they have observed you more carefully than most. And there is one specific thing they noticed about you long before everybody else did. You rarely ask a question unless you already have a reason for asking it. And I think this person noticed that pattern before anybody else did. They noticed that you do not ask a lot of random questions, you ask the question that matters, and there is a difference. Some people talk through everything they are thinking. You do not necessarily do that. You may listen for a while, remember the exact wording somebody used, and then come back to one detail later when you realize it connects to something else. The card I have here is the High Priestess, and symbolically, this feels like observation without immediate reaction. Knowing that something deserves more attention, but not needing to announce that the second you notice it. I think this person understood that about you. They may be a co-worker, a friend, somebody in the family, an acquaintance, or even someone who sits slightly outside the centre of this group. I do not feel they are necessarily extremely close to you. They have just been paying attention. And they have also been paying attention to the other person. That matters too, because they noticed that this person sounds very confident when they can speak generally, but ask them for a date, ask them what happened first, ask them who actually said something, ask them how they know. And suddenly the confidence changes. There is more explanation, more irritation, more avoiding. This observer had already seen that pattern, so after you were gone, I feel they said something that carried more weight than the embarrassed person expected. Maybe they pointed out that your question was reasonable. Maybe they said, in effect, no, I noticed that too. Or they reminded the group that the contradiction existed before you ever mentioned it. That creates another problem. Because now this person cannot easily tell everybody that you were simply being difficult. Somebody else saw it. And I think that is where the group starts separating slightly. Not into dramatic sides, it is more subtle than that. There are people who genuinely want to understand what happened. And there are people who would rather keep the original explanation because changing their opinion now would be uncomfortable. But I am seeing something else here. Another inconsistency. And this one is different from the first. Because the original story about you appears to have changed depending on who this person was speaking to. One person was told you did not understand, another was told you understood perfectly well but were being difficult, on purpose. Those two descriptions do not fit together very well, and if that is what happened, then the inaccurate version of you may not have been accidental at all. And that is where I start separating a misunderstanding from a pattern. Because people misunderstand each other all the time. Somebody can hear something incorrectly, they can remember a conversation differently. They can leave out a detail simply because they did not think it mattered. But when the description keeps changing depending on who is listening, that is different. I feel this person knew which version of you worked best with which audience. With one person you were confused, with somebody else you were stubborn. With another, you were supposedly too emotional to have a reasonable conversation. And notice what all of those versions accomplish. They make people less likely to ask you directly. The card I have here is the Eight of Cups, and symbolically, I am reading this as walking away from something that no longer holds together the way it used to. I think that is what is happening with the story this person created. People are starting to step away from it. Not necessarily from the person completely, but from automatically accepting their version, and that matters because I do not feel this person relied on enormous, obvious lies. It was more selective than that. They left certain things out. They emphasized your reaction without explaining what happened immediately before it. They described a boundary you set, but not what caused you to set it. They told people you questioned them, but maybe never mentioned that the information they gave you had already changed. So your sharp question frightened them for a very specific reason. It showed that you can trace the story backward. You remember what came first. And people who are comfortable arguing about opinions can become very uncomfortable when somebody asks them about their own words. Because now this is not, I think you were wrong. It is, but you said this earlier. So how does that fit with what you are saying now? I feel members of this group are remembering other moments when this person became vague in exactly the same way. Another question they would not answer. Another conversation where they suddenly became irritated when somebody asked for specifics. And I think the embarrassment is changing into concern now. They are wondering what else you remember, what else you noticed, and never mentioned. But I do not feel you are sitting somewhere planning how to expose them. That is actually part of why they cannot read you. You are not chasing everybody around trying to prove yourself. You already asked the question. People heard the answer, or the lack of one, and now I think this person may make one more attempt to regain control. They may approach you directly. They may suddenly become unusually friendly. Or they may send somebody else toward you with what sounds like an innocent question. But underneath it, I think they are trying to find out one thing. Exactly how much do you know? And I think that question is going to shape how they approach you. Because they may not come in asking directly. They could send you a casual message. They could suddenly become friendlier than usual. For some of you, they make a joke about what happened, almost as though they are trying to see whether you laugh with them. Or they ask, "Are you upset?" And that question may sound innocent. But I feel what they really want to know is whether you are going to say more, whether you have connected other details, whether the conversation is finished from your perspective. The card I have here is the Three of Swords. And symbolically, I am not reading this as some enormous betrayal or dramatic heartbreak. This feels more like the discomfort of something becoming impossible to ignore. Once people see the contradiction, they cannot completely unsee it. That is the consequence here. For some of you, this person may try to clear the air by giving you an explanation you never asked for. That is interesting too. Because when somebody starts answering questions you have not asked, sometimes they are trying to figure out which questions you might ask next. And I do not think you need to do very much. You do not need to reveal everything you have concluded. You do not need to argue about facts that are already sitting there. If they say something that does not make sense, you can ask another clear question. If it does make sense, fine. That consistency is what gives you the advantage here. Not aggression, not revenge, consistency. Because earlier this group was deciding what they thought about you based partly on what somebody else told them. Now the situation has reversed. This person is wondering what you think of them. And more importantly, they are wondering what everybody else has started to notice. That is a very different position. I think The real embarrassment was never simply that they paused after your question. It was that something larger collapsed in front of other people, the assumption that you could be managed by giving you a quick explanation. The assumption that you would become emotional enough to lose the point. The assumption that if they sounded confident, you would stop checking whether the story made sense. That assumption is gone now, and I think that is what changes this group going forward. Because even the people who do not completely agree with you have learned something about how you operate. They know you listen, they know you remember, and they know that when you finally ask a question, there is usually a reason. So now I want to look at what that changes for you from this point forward. Because I do not think these people are going to interact with you quite the same way again. And I think the first change is that people are going to listen differently when you speak. Not because everybody suddenly agrees with you. That is not what I mean, but there is more attention now. Somebody who might have dismissed one of your questions before is going to pause and think, why are they asking that? Somebody who repeated information about you without checking it may become much more careful about doing that again. And one or two people in this group are quietly reconsidering their own judgment. The card I have here is judgment, and symbolically, this feels very appropriate. Because this is not really about punishment, it is about reassessment. People looking at what they thought they knew and asking themselves whether they got it right the first time. I think that is happening with you. The person who got embarrassed may become more guarded around you now. They know you notice inconsistencies, they know sounding confident is not necessarily enough, and they know that if something does not fit, you may not challenge it immediately. You may simply remember it. That changes how somebody behaves. But I do not think the biggest outcome here is that you won. It is bigger than that. The inaccurate version of you is harder to maintain now because people have something else to compare it with. They have watched you themselves. They saw how you handled pressure. They saw how long you listened. They heard the question. And they watched somebody struggle with an answer that should have been simple. That experience carries more weight than a description somebody gave them beforehand. And I keep coming back to that word from the beginning, sharp. But I do not think they mean sharp as in cruel. I do not think they mean somebody waiting for an opportunity to embarrass people. They mean perceptive, precise. Someone who notices when one detail does not fit with another and has enough discipline not to react before they understand why. That is what changed the room. And the strange thing is, this moment may not have seemed enormous to you. You may have asked the question and moved on, but other people saw something important. They saw who could support what they were saying and who could not. They saw who stayed composed and who became defensive. And once that happens, credibility shifts, quietly, but permanently. So when this group talks about you now, I do not think they are talking about the same person they thought they understood before. Because now they know something they did not know then. Your silence was never proof that you missed what was happening. Sometimes your silence meant you had already noticed more than anybody realized.